Have you ever heard the story of a boy who had nothing, no family, no home, no power, but still changed an entire kingdom? In the heart of ancient Africa, in a land called Zawadi, where kings ruled from golden thrones and warriors marched in shining armor, it was not a soldier, not a noble, not even a priest who saved the kingdom from collapse. It was an orphan, a barefoot boy named Zuberi. But his path was not paved with ease. It was forged with truth, tested with betrayal, and crowned with destiny. This is his story. Long ago, under the golden sun and mighty baobab trees, there was a kingdom known as Zawadi. It was a land of beauty and wisdom, rich with rivers that whispered songs of old, and hills that remembered every footstep of ancestors past. Zawadi was ruled by King Zuberi V, a noble but weary ruler. Though he had no children of his own, he ruled justly for decades. Yet time, like the river, moves forward, and age had begun to press on his bones. His advisors whispered of succession. The people wondered who would rise when the king fell. But while the palace buzzed with power games and politics, far from its towering walls lived a boy no one noticed. His name was Zuberi, which meant strong in the old tongue. But to the eye, villagers, he was simply the orphan boy. At only 9, he lost both parents to a sickness that swept through his village. No siblings, no uncles, no one. The boy learned to survive by doing what others wouldn't. He fetched water from the crocodile-infested river. He swept the dusty floors of market shops. He carried loads for merchants too lazy to lift their own bags. And yet, he never complained. Not once. "Zuberi," the baker would say, tossing him a half-burnt loaf, "Why are you always smiling, boy?" And he would reply, "Because I still have the sky to cover me and the earth to stand on." That was Zuberi. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the heat clung to the skin like a blanket, Zuberi was walking back from the market carrying a sack of cassava roots for an old woman. Her legs trembled too much to walk far, and Zuberi, noticing this, had offered to help. As he made his way through the dusty path between the thick, rustling savanna grass, he heard a voice. "Boy, come here, boy." An old man, cloaked in tattered brown robes, leaned heavily against a walking stick. His face was creased with age, his back bent like a bow. "I've dropped my water gourd. My legs are not what they once were," the man said, gesturing to a hilltop where a small calabash rolled down the side. Without hesitation, Zuberi dropped the cassava sack and sprinted up the hill. It was steep. The wind resisted him. Thorns scratched his legs, but he didn't stop until he grabbed the gourd, cupped it in both hands, and gently brought it back. "Thank you," the man said, his voice quiet. Zuberi bowed. "Elders are like trees. If we don't protect them, the sun, it will scorch us all." The old man smiled faintly. "May the ancestors walk with you." Zuberi didn't know it then, but this man was not just any elder. He was Priest Wema, one of the king's secret spiritual advisors. He had been wandering the land, disguised, to see how the people lived, and Zuberi had caught his eye. The next morning, Zuberi was sweeping the front of the blacksmith's hut when a royal guard on horseback rode into the village. "Where is the boy called Zuberi?" the guard called. Villagers froze. Children peeked from behind their mothers. Zuberi stepped forward slowly, broom in hand. The guard looked him over with disbelief. "You are Zuberi?" "Yes, sir." "You are to come with me." The priest of the High Temple has summoned you. Murmurs filled the air. What could an orphan possibly offer the palace? Zuberi, both curious and nervous, followed. They rode for hours across hills and over rivers. Birds flew beside them. Goats bleated in distant farms. At last, the spires of the great royal city rose into view, gleaming with sunlit clay and patterned stone. When Zuberi stepped through the palace gates, it felt like walking into another world. Palace life was strange. The servants wore crisp robes. The air smelled of incense and meat stew. Everyone had a role, and Zuberi was made to scrub floors. From noble chambers to kitchen alleys, he cleaned. He kept quiet. He listened. The other palace boys teased him. "Don't drink from the royal wells, Orphan. They're not for rats." He didn't argue. He smiled. He did his work. But one thing he always did was help. He helped the cook carry pots, helped the old guard polish his sandals, helped the gardener lift his water bucket. Even when he was mocked, he helped. Then came the night of the silver bracelet. A priceless heirloom had gone missing from the royal treasury. Panic spread. Nobles whispered of thieves in the ranks. By dawn, guards had lined up every servant. "You were in the East Wing last night?" A guard barked at Zuberi. "Yes, to clean the stairway," he said. "You're the only one without family, without ties. No one to vouch for you." He was thrown into the palace holding cell. Zuberi said nothing. He simply looked down, eyes calm. Then, the king came. King Zuberi himself. He was older than Zuberi imagined, beard like river moss, eyes like dying stars. "Boy," he said, "why do you not defend yourself?" Zuberi knelt. "I would never steal, but if you believe I did, then I accept whatever judgment you see fit." The king studied him. Minutes passed, silent. Then he turned. "To the guards! Release him, now!" That evening, Zuberi was summoned privately. The king's chamber was filled with lion carvings and drums of old wars. "Tell me," the king asked, "why didn't you fight to prove your innocence?" Zuberi answered, "Because truth doesn't shout. It waits." The king's eyes widened slightly. "You remind me of someone I knew long ago." From that day, Zuberi was given small personal tasks for the king. Cleaning scrolls, fetching water, organizing herbs, and the king watched. Quietly, Zuberi still slept in the servant quarters, still ate plain porridge. But something was changing. The boy no one saw was now noticed by the one who ruled all. Over the following weeks, Zuberi's tasks changed. He was no longer scrubbing latrines or sweeping courtyards. Instead, he was entrusted with small yet meaningful duties inside the royal chambers, lighting incense, organizing scrolls in the king's study, polishing ceremonial staffs that had seen centuries of rule. Though many in the palace still looked down on him, the king began to notice the boy's silent wisdom. Zuberi spoke rarely, but when he did, it was always with respect and insight beyond his years. One evening, King Zuberi sat alone in the royal garden, beneath the ancient moon tree, a tree older than the kingdom itself. The silver leaves shimmered like stars, and the garden was quiet except for the gentle hum of crickets. Zuberi approached, carrying a tray of honeyed tea. "You walk like someone carrying an invisible crown," the king said suddenly, eyes still closed. Zuberi paused, unsure if he should respond. "My father once said, if your heart is heavy with kindness, the world will feel your steps." The king opened his eyes and turned to him. "Your father said this?" "Yes, before the river took him." There was silence between them. Not awkward, but full, like a river pooling before the rapids. "Sit," the king finally said. "Speak with me, not to me." Zuberi hesitated, then sat cross-legged at the king's side. That night began something that had not happened in years. The king laughed. News traveled faster than wind in the palace. The orphan boy dines with the king now. He must be using some kind of spell. He's dangerous and clever. But Zuberi paid no mind to the whispers. He woke early, worked harder, and served without pride. Still, his presence caused unrest. Noble families who had long prepared their sons to be close to the king now found themselves overshadowed by a boy with no lineage, no inheritance, no name. Among the most threatened was Lord Bako, the high advisor, and one of the kingdom's oldest noblemen. He wore wealth-like armor and despised humility, which he mistook for weakness. "This boy will ruin everything," Bako muttered to his son. "We've waited for decades to push our bloodline closer to the throne. That street. Rat must go." Weeks passed. One stormy night, lightning cracked the sky, and thunder roared like the angry voice of 1,000 spirits. Zuberi was awakened by a soft knock. A royal guard stood in the doorway. "His Majesty requests your presence, now." Zuberi followed. Through dim corridors to the king's private chamber. Inside, the king lay weak, pale, and coughing. "Zuberi," the king wheezed, waving off the physicians. "Come, closer." Zuberi rushed to his side. "I am dying." "No." "Your strength will return," Zuberi whispered. The king smiled weakly. "A king always knows the shadows that gather near his end. But I am not afraid of death. I fear leaving my kingdom in the hands of those who worship power over people." He placed something into Zuberi's hand, a pendant shaped like a lion's eye. "This belonged to the founder of our bloodline. I give it to you, not because you are noble, but because you are true." Tears welled in Zuberi's eyes. "Why me?" "Because you have nothing to gain and everything to protect." The following morning, the king's condition had stabilized, though he remained bedridden. Zuberi began to care for him like a son would, bringing herbs, reading aloud from the Book of Ancestors, placing cold cloths on his head when the fever returned. One day, the head priest entered the chamber and found Zuberi adjusting the king's pillows. "You are not of royal blood," the priest said sternly. "Why do you act like a prince?" "I act like a servant," Zuberi replied calmly, "but I do so with love." The priest's brow softened. "Then you serve more than the king. You serve Zawadi itself." A week later, Zuberi was walking through the palace courtyard when he noticed something strange. 2 young guards struggling to carry a large wooden crate. It slipped, and golden trinkets spilled out. They looked panicked. Zuberi walked toward them. "Return that to the treasury," he said simply. They froze. "You didn't see anything." Zuberi sighed. "One lie will grow into 1,000. The guards lunged at him, but Zuberi was quicker. He darted through the alley, straight to the captain of the guard. The 2 thieves were arrested by sunset. But they were not just any guards. They were nephews of Lord Bako. The nobleman was furious, humiliated, and dangerous. That night, in a shadowy room lit by a single flickering torch, Lord Bako met with 3 cloaked nobles. "The king is old. His health fades," he hissed. "That orphan is stealing the throne with sympathy, but kindness is a weakness, and weakness can be crushed." They devised a plot to poison Zuberi and frame him for the attempted murder of the king. It would be swift, silent, and irreversible. But one person overheard. Her name was Naya, a palace maid who often cleaned the council chambers late at night. She had grown fond of Zuberi, not because he was kind to her, but because he listened. No one ever listened to maids. But Zuberi always greeted her, asked about her day, and shared his bread when hers was stale. When Nia heard the nobles whispering death, she snuck into the servant quarters and shook Zuberi awake. "They plan to poison your water at dawn," she whispered, trembling. "You must not drink it!" Zuberi sat up, eyes burning not with fear, but calm. "Thank you, Nia. But we must do more than survive. We must show them for who they truly are." At dawn, Zuberi entered the royal kitchen. Quietly, he slipped into the shadows and waited. Just before breakfast, a kitchen hand approached his water jug and poured in a small vial of liquid. Then quickly vanished. Zuberi stepped out. Later, in the council room, Zuberi offered that same jug to Lord Bako. "Would you do the honor of tasting it first?" Zuberi asked with a smile. Bako turned pale. "No need for that." But Zuberi snapped his fingers. Guards emerged. Nia appeared. So did the kitchen hand. Now tied and gagged, the entire plan unraveled. The nobles were arrested, and the king, informed of everything, summoned Zuberi. The king sat upright for the first time in days. "You saved my life," he said. Zuberi knelt. "I only told the truth, and in doing so, you revealed the rot in my court." He leaned forward. "I once feared who would sit on this throne after me. Now, I wonder if I've already found him." Zuberi looked up, stunned. "I am no king?" "No," the king said. "But sometimes, the crown finds those who never chased it." The king's words echoed through Zuberi's heart. Sometimes the crown finds those who never chased. Urias. The next day, the royal court awoke to stunning news. Zuberi was appointed as the king's junior advisor. The announcement shocked nobles and citizens alike. A boy from the village? A servant? Surely this is madness. But the king stood firm. He summoned the elders, priests, warriors, and advisors. "If we value only bloodlines," he said, "we'll drown in the past. This boy has shown more wisdom, loyalty, and courage than men thrice his age. Zuberi will not replace tradition. He will renew it." And so, dressed in a deep blue robe embroidered with gold thread, Zuberi stepped into the Hall of Elders. He bowed deeply before the throne, not with pride but humility. Zuberi's first day was quiet. He spoke little, listened more. He watched how nobles debated, how warriors complained, and how scribes twisted truths into scrolls. But soon, he began to ask questions. Why do farmers pay more tax than gold merchants? Why must girls be excluded from temple schools? Why do distant villages never receive grain during droughts? The nobles were annoyed. "These are traditions," they grumbled. But the king smiled. "Sometimes, tradition must bend to make space for justice," he said. With the king's blessing, Zuberi began to push small reforms. He reduced grain taxes for poor villages. He opened a council for commoners to voice their grievances. He convinced the king to build a new school that accepted both boys and girls. The people loved him. The nobles hated him. But none could deny change had begun. One afternoon, while Zuberi reviewed complaints from Western farmers, a messenger burst into the chamber. "Urgent news, riders from the northern border. They demand audience with the king." The northern lands of Zawadi had long been quiet. Tribal treaties had lasted for generations. But peace is fragile. A tall, broad-shouldered stranger stepped into the court. He wore tiger-hide armor and carried a jagged spear. "I am Chief Baraka of the mountain clans," he declared. "Our lands grow dry. Our people starve. We asked for help. None came, so now we take." He tossed a goat's skull on the palace floor. It was carved with Zawadi's crest, a warning. The palace exploded into debate. The generals demanded immediate retaliation. "Strike now, crush them before they cross." "Our river!" the priests called for sacrifices. "The gods must be appeased before war." But Zuberi stood up. "Why have we ignored their cries until now? Are they not our brothers?" "Do not mistake peace for cowardice, boy," one general shouted. "I do not," Zuberi replied. "But do not mistake anger for strength either." The room fell silent. Zuberi turned to the king. "Let me go to them. Let me speak, not as an advisor, but as one who once had nothing." The king stared long into his eyes. "Go." And so, with only 4 guards and Nia at his side, Zuberi rode north. The journey was long, dusty paths, jagged cliffs, wild beasts in the shadows. But Zuberi never complained. When the wheels of the cart broke, he helped push it. When a child cried at the border, he gave away his food. And when they reached the mountain tribes, Zuberi stepped forward, unarmed. "I come in peace. I come with ears, not swords. Chief Baraka watched from a wooden throne atop a cliff. "Why should I believe the palace sends anything but lies?" Zuberi reached into his robe and pulled out the lion eye pendant the king had given him. "I carry not titles, but truth. If I lie, let the mountain swallow me whole." For 3 days, Zuberi stayed with the mountain people. He ate their dried roots, slept on stone, listened to stories of drought, disease, and royal neglect. Then he stood before their fire and spoke. "You have been forgotten. That is the truth. And truth can be ugly. But forgetting does not mean forsaking. Let me be the bridge between your pain and our palace. Let the river of peace flow again." Chief Baraka watched silently, then slowly nodded. "You may return. But know this, if your words are empty, our next visit will be with fire." Zuberi bowed. "Then I will return not with words, but water." Zuberi returned to Zawadi triumphant, but not all shared his joy. Lord Bako, though disgraced, still had influence. He gathered angry nobles. "This boy will weaken us. First reforms, now surrender. Shall we wait until we are raided?" But the people stood behind Zuberi. Mothers whose children now went to school, farmers who paid fair taxes, elders who finally had medicine in their villages. When the king summoned a public court to vote on Zuberi's treaty with the mountain tribes, the entire square overflowed with citizens. The vote was unanimous. Zuberi's proposal for shared resources, tribal schools and cross-border farming passed. The mountain clans would now become allies, not enemies. That night, the king called Zuberi to the moon tree once more. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "You are not my advisor. You are Zawadi's future." He reached out and placed the lion eye pendant around Zuberi's neck once again, but this time in front of the royal council. The people cheered. The nobles bowed, but Zuberi, ever humble, whispered, "I am only a boy who remembered how it felt to be forgotten." And so, the orphan became the voice of millions. But destiny still had more in store for him. Much more. Months passed, and Zuberi's influence spread across Zawadi like the sunrise warming a cold savanna. New schools opened in tribal lands. The elderly received medicine. Trade routes to the mountain people flourished, but just as a tree draws both sun and storm, Zuberi's rise drew hidden enemies. One of them was very close. Naya, the kind-hearted palace maid who once saved Zuberi's life, began to act distant. She smiled less, avoided his eyes, hid bruises beneath her sleeves. Zuberi noticed, but she always said, "I'm just tired." But Zuberi's instincts, sharpened from hardship, told him the truth. Something was terribly wrong. One night, Zuberi followed Nia as she slipped from the servant quarters into the forbidden west wing of the palace. He kept to the shadows, silent as a hunting owl. There, in a dim room beneath flickering torchlight, stood Lord Bako, chained, but very much alive. Nia dropped a small scroll into his hands, tears running down her face. "I don't want to do this, but they'll kill my brother if I don't," she whispered. "You're doing the right thing," Bako hissed. "Once that orphan is out of the way, we'll both be safe. You'll have a new life. A better one." Zuberi stepped into the light. "Nia," she froze. He looked not angry, but wounded. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears burst from her eyes. "They took him, Zuberi. My little brother Kato. I had no choice." Zuberi stepped closer and gently took her trembling hands. "You always have a choice. And tonight, we choose to fight back." That same night, Zuberi and Nia rode into the slums outside the city gates, where Bako's loyalists hid Kato in an old spice warehouse. Zuberi, disguised in peasant robes, snuck through the rear entrance. Inside, Two guards played a gambling game, unaware. In a blur, Zuberi tackled one. Nia smashed a pot over the other's head. They rushed to the corner cage and found Kato, no older than 10, skinny and scared. "Naya!" he cried. She lifted him into her arms, but as they turned to flee, a blade pressed against Zuberi's neck. "Going somewhere, boy?" sneered a cloaked man. Suddenly, an arrow whistled through the air and struck the attacker's shoulder. Zuberi turned. It was Chief Baraka. He had followed them secretly. "I told you I'd return with fire, but this time, it's for your enemies." Zuberi returned to the palace victorious, Kato safe in his sister's arms, but celebration was short-lived. A messenger rushed into the courtyard, breathless. "It's the king! He collapsed!" Zuberi raced to the moon tree chambers. There lay King Jabari, his breathing shallow, his once sharp eyes dimming. "My time has come," he rasped. No, please," Zuberi whispered, falling to his knees. "You've led well," the king said, "but now you must lead, alone." He reached for Zuberi's hand. "Don't become like the ones we fought. Let your heart stay open, even when power tempts it shut." Then, his grip loosened. The king of Zawadi was gone. The palace wept. The kingdom mourned. Zuberi did not speak for 3 days. He fasted, prayed, and wandered the palace gardens alone. He had lost a second father, but when he finally emerged, he was no longer a boy. He was a man carrying the weight of a people. The council called for a vote. Who would take the throne? The generals wanted a seasoned warrior. The priests wanted a prophet. The nobles wanted a puppet. But the people gathered outside the palace walls, chanting one name: Zuberi, Zuberi, Zuberi. That evening, Zuberi stood before the royal seat, the same one he once scrubbed as a servant. The high priest stepped forward with the crown of the lion, golden, rimmed with ivory older than memory itself. He held it above Zuberi's head, but Zuberi raised his hand. Not yet. The court gasped. "I will not wear a crown unless the people choose it freely. Let them decide, not tradition, not wealth, not fear." So a great assembly was called. People from every corner of Zawadi came. Farmers, healers, traders, hunters. Each spoke. Each debated, and when the final drum sounded, 1,000 voices rose in one word: yes. The next day, beneath the rising sun, Zuberi stood atop the moon tree steps. The high priest placed the crown on his head. But Zuberi didn't smile. He looked out across the faces of his people and spoke. "I was born with nothing but a mother's love and a father's hope. I will rule not as a king above you, but as a servant among you. May the throne remain low so all may reach it, and may justice rise high so none may escape it." The crowd erupted. From dust to destiny, the orphan had become the lion of Zawadi. Zuberi sat on the lion throne, but it didn't feel like victory. The crown was heavy, not just on his head, but on his soul. He was no longer the boy who swept palace floors. He was no longer the boy who questioned tradition. He was now the symbol of Zawadi's hope. And hope, he quickly learned, was fragile. Only weeks after his coronation, dark clouds refused to form. The rains that had once danced over Zawadi's fields disappeared. The rivers ran low. The cattle grew thin. Children cried from hunger. Zuberi summoned his council. "We need to distribute grain reserves to the eastern farmlands," a noble raised his voice. "But that grain is for royal feasts and city trade." Zuberi didn't hesitate. "Then cancel the feasts. Let the trade pause. A nation cannot dance when its stomach is empty." He rode out himself, delivering food with his own hands, his royal robe stained with sweat and dust. But not all were pleased. Whispers started to spread. The crown was never meant for him. He's cursed the rain. The gods are angry. In the temples, some priests fanned the flames. He was not chosen by prophecy. He was chosen by men. Zuberi stood firm. I was chosen by compassion, not magic. If the gods test me, then I will answer with action. Still, a shadow crept through the kingdom, and it wore the face of an old foe. Lord Bako, though banished to the borderlands, had not stopped scheming. He gathered rebels, mercenaries, and priests, hungry for the old ways. We will strike not with armies, but with poison, he told them. Their plan? To poison Zuberi slowly, using the very food he gave to the poor. One of Zuberi's own cooks, bribed, blackmailed, slipped a black root into his porridge. Zuberi collapsed during a council meeting. Panic spread. He was rushed to the palace chambers. Days, he lay unconscious, burning with fever, fighting visions of his mother, the river, and the moon tree. In his delirium, Zuberi heard a voice. It was his father's. Son, destiny is not about crowns. It's about choices. And yours are not finished. Then he saw a young child, barefoot, crying beside an empty bowl, and a lion appeared. Roaring in the distance, he awoke with a gasp. He was alive, weak, but alive. When word spread that Zuberi had been poisoned, the people rioted. They stormed the palace gates demanding justice. Nia, now leader of the palace guard, arrested the traitorous cook. He confessed everything. Zuberi rose from his sickbed, still frail, and addressed the crowds from the moon tree steps. I do not blame those who fear change, he said, but I do blame those who poison it. We will move forward, not through fear, but through truth. The people roared with approval, and for the first time in weeks, clouds began to gather in the sky. In the midst of chaos, Zuberi found peace in the quiet presence of Nia. She had stood by him in darkness, guarded him with her life, and seen him rise and fall. One evening, as the rains finally returned and bathed the kingdom in silver, Zuberi turned to her. I was born alone. I ruled alone. But I no longer wish to be alone. Nia didn't reply with words. She simply took his hand, and the people of Zawadi began whispering not of curses, but of a royal wedding. Under Zuberi's reign, peace returned. The mountain tribes helped build new irrigation systems. Grain reserves were protected under public guardians. A new temple was built, not for gods of fear, but gods of unity. Children learned history not as names of kings, but as stories of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. And once a year, Zuberi walked among the people in plain clothes, without guards. Because a king, he said, should never forget what it means to be a servant. One night, as the moon tree bloomed under a full moon, Zuberi sat alone. He held the lion eye pendant in his hand. It no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a promise. He whispered into the wind, I was once a boy who had nothing. Now I am a man trusted with everything. I vow to never let this crown silence my heart. And somewhere in the distance, the lion roared again. Years passed. Under Zuberi's rule, Zawadi blossomed like the baobab in full sun. Trade routes stretched like vines across borders. Children learned to read in every dialect. And hunger, once a silent killer, became a tale told to warn, not a fate to fear. Zuberi and Nia, now king and queen, had a son, Tendo, named after the Swahili word for act of love. The kingdom celebrated his birth for 7 days, but Zuberi knew, peace is not the end of struggle. It is only the calm between tests. And the next test would come not from beyond the borders, but from within. The High Council, once unified behind Zuberi's leadership, began to fracture. Some believed the king had grown too soft. The people love him. But love does not guard a kingdom, said Elder Wakio. a seasoned warrior. Others whispered behind beaded curtains. He favors farmers over nobles. He lowers taxes for the poor, but not for us. Zuberi listened. He met with his council in the Hall of Fire, a circular chamber with ancestral masks lining the walls. "I will not rule for wealth," he declared, "nor for fear. I will rule for justice, even if it offends power." But his words did not silence ambition. Elder Wakio secretly met with foreign traders who envied Zawadi's growing strength. In exchange for gold and weapons, they struck a deal: destabilize Zuberi's rule and replace him with a puppet prince. Their plan: use Prince Tendo. The boy was only 10, but the plan was to manipulate public fear, claim the child was kidnapped, frame rebels, and spark distrust in the king's leadership. If people saw that not even his own son was safe, they might call for his resignation. But destiny has a way of rewriting betrayal with revelation. One moonless night, masked men crept into the palace gardens. They slipped past guards, drugged the dogs, reached the royal nursery. But the bed was empty, the window wide open. Instead, on the pillow lay a note. "You taught me to be brave, Papa. I heard them coming. I hid in the moon tree, Tendo." The child had evaded his own captors using the very lessons Zuberi had once learned: hiding in shadows, listening to wind shifts, trusting instinct. The guards found the attackers tangled in the tree's vines, ambushed by the royal defenders, lying in wait. It had all been a trap. Zuberi had suspected treachery and set the bait. The next day, Zuberi summoned the conspirators, Elder Wakio among them, before the entire kingdom. But instead of ordering their execution, he did something no king before him had dared. He held a public trial. Elders, citizens, even children were allowed to attend. Witnesses spoke. Records were read. Even Wakio himself was allowed to speak in his defense. When judgment was passed and guilt declared, Zuberi spoke. "This is not revenge. This is restoration. Zawadi will not return to darkness by punishing light, but betrayal must carry consequence." Wakio and the traders were exiled, not just from land, but from legacy. Their names were removed from public records. Decades later, Zuberi's beard had turned silver. Prince Tendo, now a young man, stood tall and strong, a blend of his mother's sharp gaze and his father's calm fire. One evening, Tendo approached his father beside the moon tree. "Father," he said, "the people want me to lead soon. Are you ready to let go?" Zuberi didn't answer immediately. He placed a hand on the old tree's bark. "When I was your age, I fought to be seen. You have always been seen. You've never known the weight of dust in your lungs or hunger in your bones. So let me ask, do you rule because they expect you to, or because you choose to?" Tendo paused, then replied, "I choose to serve, not rule." Zuberi smiled. "Then you are ready." A week later, in front of the same moon tree where his journey began, Zuberi removed the lion's crown and placed it gently on his son's head. There were no trumpets, no dancers, just quiet tears and warm smiles. As the sun set, Zuberi walked into the crowd, not as a king, but as a father, a friend, and a storyteller. And somewhere in the distance, a child told a friend, "My grandfather was a king, but before that, he was just a boy with a broom." Zuberi faded from the public eye, but never from the public heart. He spent his days walking the fields with farmers, listening to village griots spin tales beneath the stars, and teaching his grandson to read from scrolls older than the palace itself. He no longer wore fine robes. His crown gathered dust, and he smiled more than ever before. Children called him Babu wa Ukombozi, grandfather of freedom. His name became more than a memory. It became a myth. One warm evening, a stranger arrived at Zawadi's gates. His clothes were foreign, his skin pale like river clay, his voice heavy with another land's rhythm. He carried only a worn satchel, a leather journal, and a name no one could pronounce. But when he spoke to the guards, his request was clear. "I seek the orphan who became a king." At first, they laughed. "That was decades ago. You're too late." But the traveler smiled. No story lives that long unless it still breathes. He was brought before Prince Tendo, now ruler of Zawadi. Tendo tilted his head curiously. "Why do you seek him?" The traveler opened his journal. Inside were maps, sketches, legends passed down by foreign tribes. "Because where I come from, kings are born of blood, but your king, he was born of dust, and I want to know how." Tendo led the traveler deep into the eastern gardens, where an old man knelt beside a pond, feeding turtles. Zuberi. He looked up with a knowing smile. "I've been waiting for you," he said. The traveler bowed. "I have come to record your truth, not the legend." "The man," Zuberi chuckled. "The legend is the man, only trimmed at the edges." They sat for hours beneath the moon tree, Zuberi sharing stories never told, laughter thick in the air, silences heavy with memory. He spoke not as a king, but as a boy who once chased mangoes barefoot and dreamed of meat on his plate. As the sun dipped low, the traveler asked, "If you could do it all again, would you still want the throne?" Zuberi looked into the horizon. "No," he said softly, "I would want the broom." The traveler frowned. "The broom?" Zuberi nodded. "Yes, because the broom taught me service, and from service came the strength to carry a kingdom." Then he leaned in close. "Tell your people this. A crown means nothing unless it remembers the floor it once swept." The traveler stayed for 3 days. When he left, he carried not gold nor gifts, but a scroll, Zuberi's life, written in ink. When he returned to his land, he published the tale, translated into dozens of languages. Children in cold cities read of the boy who hid in kitchens. Scholars debated the justice of a public trial for treason. Leaders studied the laws of Zuberi's kingdom and reformed their own. But one line echoed louder than all. He was born with nothing, but gave everything. Years later, as Zuberi neared his 90th year, he sat alone beneath the moon tree once more. The birds were quiet, the wind gentle. He closed his eyes, holding the lion-eye pendant still hanging from his neck. He remembered the river, his mother's lullaby, the broom in his hand, the crown on his brow. And then he let go, peacefully, without fear. Prince Tendo announced his grandfather's passing with both sorrow and celebration. No grand tomb was built. Zuberi's final wish was simple. "Plant a garden where I am buried, let children run, and flowers grow, and may no one kneel before my memory, only walk beside it." And so they did, a circular garden called Bustani ya Mwanga. The Garden of Light now blooms at the palace edge. Children chase butterflies there. Old men tell stories of a boy with nothing, who changed everything, and if you ever walk the paths of Zawadi and pause beneath the shade of the moon tree, you may hear a whisper on the wind. Courage begins not with a roar, but with a broom in hand and hope in the heart, and you'll know Zuberi still walks with them. Years passed, decades even, and still the name Zuberi was not written merely in books, it was etched into hearts. Every generation retold his story, not as ancient history, but as a living fire that danced through the soul of Zawadi. His broom was carved into fire statues, his pendant worn as a symbol of strength. And every child was told, "Never say you are too small to change the world." Zuberi swept the palace before he ruled it. On the anniversary of his birth, the Garden of Light bloomed brighter than ever. The old moon tree, towering and wise, stood in full blossom. Children performed plays of Zuberi's life beneath its branches. In every village across the land, fires were lit and tales passed from mouth to mouth. Not just of what he did, but of who he was. A boy who gave his food to the sick. A man who dared to hold a public trial when fear demanded silence. A king who walked behind his people, not above them. The lion eye pendant became the symbol of justice across nations. It was no longer seen as a trinket, but a vow, a promise to lead not through fear, but through service. Leaders from distant lands visited Zawadi, studying how peace was preserved for generations without tyranny, without greed. And at the core of every diplomatic scroll or royal decree lay Zuberi's first law: before you rule others, prove that you can serve them. In a dusty village on Zawadi's edge, a young girl sat on her grandfather's knee. "Babu," she asked, "was Zuberi real or just a story?" The old man smiled. He pointed to the garden, where a little boy swept dust from the path for the schoolteacher. "Do you see him?" he asked. She nodded. "Then yes," the old man said softly. "Zuberi is real. He lives in every act of courage, in every voice that speaks when silence is easier, in every heart that refuses to bow to fear." The girl smiled, and that night she dreamed of a lion who wept tears of gold. So, dear listener, you've heard the tale of the orphan who became a king. But do not close this book thinking it ends here, because Zuberi's journey is your journey. His broom, his heart, his roar, they live in every hand that lifts another. Maybe you're just a face in the crowd. Maybe you're overlooked, forgotten, broken. But remember, greatness doesn't begin with power. It begins with choice. Choose kindness. Choose justice. Choose courage, even when your voice shakes. And one day, someone may whisper your name beneath a tree, just like they do for Zuberi, because in the end, legends don't die. They rise again and again from the dust. Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment "end" so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as, please let us know, where are you watching from? Before leaving, please hit the subscribe button, comment your thought, and share with your nearest and dearest one. See you in the next one. Until to the next one, stay happy. Goodbye.